pattern 4 is our next pattern, and that is an alliance or a coalition of the military, the technocratic elites, and the bourgeoisie elite. This pattern is what I call military dictatorship. But notice that the dictatorship is being moderated by the bourgeoisie element. When you incorporate the middle-class bourgeoisie into the dictatorship, you get a kind of a support from, at least in the urban areas. There is considerable commercial freedom for this element of the population, that is the bourgeoisie, that are being incorporated. And for most Americans, they would understand this pattern readily if I mention the country that best exemplified it. And in this case, really, it's Chile under General Pinochet. It would be that pattern, the military, the technocratic, and the bourgeoisie. In the Middle East, however, if you look for example, there are several examples. The most important one, perhaps, would be Iran under the Shah after the White Revolution in 1963. So remember, the Shah of Iran really is in two patterns, the first one and also in the fourth pattern. In this particular example, what is absent is that he dumped the traditional elites. He took over their lands, had a very, very large land redistribution program instituted, and he called the change process a white revolution. Now, the word revolution immediately conjures up the speed of the change process. This was still part of a controlled formula, except the membership now switched. He's going to cast his fortune with the middle-class bourgeoisie, and is going to dump on the traditional elites. And by the way, this revolution was very much opposed by the Islamic groups, and the first time that Ayatollah Khomeini actually comes to the scene, political scene, is his march that he instigated against the so-called White Revolution. So the Shah of Iran would be a good example of this. The other example would be Egypt under President Sadat and President Mubarak, which continued pretty much the same path. So Nasser, if you compare Sadat with Nasser of Egypt, Nasser changed Egypt very rapidly. But Sadat quickly aligned himself with the commercial bourgeoisie element, and under him, the pace of change slowed. However, the degree of commercial freedom granted to the bourgeoisie significantly increased under Sadat. I would also include in this model Syria under President Hafez al-Assad, and also his son, Bashar Assad, until, of course, the recent uprising and the civil war that's going on. Up until that time, like until 2011, Syria would fit the same model. Again, a military dictatorship consisting of the military, technocratic, and bourgeoisie element. The question now is, how did we feel about this particular pattern? And by this pattern, really remember now, it develops later in the change process than the first three patterns. So when we say, how do we feel, that's an appropriate question, because the United States is now the major player in the Middle East. Again, the answer depends on how they felt toward Israel. We loved the Shah. Shah had very nice relation with Israel. He had all but formal relation with Israel. In fact, Israelis had a de facto embassy in Iran under the Shah. After the revolution, Sadat became our favorite Arab, replacing King Hussein of Jordan throughout the 70s and the early 80s. On the other hand, those regimes who had the same pattern, but they were hostile toward Israel, we also were hostile toward them. And you can see this in our relation with both Syria and also later on with Iraq. So this pattern is occurring later on in the change process, and very important states in the Middle East are represented by this. Let me now begin with the pattern number 5. Pattern number 5 occurred really during the very last stages of the change process. So this is the most recent type of pattern. Both pattern number 5 and pattern 6 are the latest. And what you see in that pattern is an alliance of what I call the populist elite and the security forces. The pattern I call authoritarian populism or populist authoritarianism. Usually for this pattern to appear, you need a charismatic leader who can excite the masses, who can rally the masses. But nonetheless, and since no leader is able to excite everyone in a society, there are significant opposition to them. And to deal with that opposition, for a regime like that to survive, they need to also include the security forces who will keep in check the opposition. But it's very different than the kind of a, the kind of absolute dictatorship that you see, for example, with Stalin. Stalin wasn't popular, but he certainly was a dictator. In this case, you have masses supporting the charismatic leaders. That's why we have the populist part in it. But you also have the security forces for those who are not excited and who are prone to challenge the leadership. The best example of this pattern would be Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran. Certainly was a charismatic leader, but his very, very first move, even before he had fully consolidated his power, or because he hadn't fully consolidated his power, was to create the Revolutionary Guards. And the Revolutionary Guards, their job was to first protect the regime and also to make sure that the army that they had inherited from the Shah will not pull a coup. So it was a check on the army as well. So the security forces were very important. I should point out that, as I said, this is a very late stages. This is a pattern that occurs in the very late stages of change. And in the Middle East, the rise of populist leader in many ways has been due to, or I should say reflects a reaction to the humiliation of the nations in the hands of the Western imperialism, including the collusion of the so-called moderate responsible leaders in these countries with the imperialists. These moderate responsible leaders are almost uniformly seen as the lackeys of the West. So in some important sense, one could say that political Islam fills the political lacuna, the political void left by the defeat of secular nationalism in its confrontation with the Western imperialism. So that confrontation really was very, very significant in defining the future pattern. This brings me to the very last pattern, and obviously this is the most recent one. And this is the alliance of what I call clerical elites and security forces. the name that I give to this pattern is modern theocracy. It is modern. It's not in any way related to ancient Islam, for example. It's a modern theocracy that uses military and security forces to maintain force. The key difference with the previous one is the absence of a charismatic populist leader. So the example that I have in mind is also Iran after the demise of Ayatollah Khomeini. He died in 1989, and since then Iran has evolved into a rigid, growingly rigid modern theocracy. And it has happened really because the vacuum left by the departure of the charismatic leader could not be filled by any other charismatic leader. So none of the current leaders of Iran are having the kind of following that Ayatollah Khomeini had. And as a result, it's the elites of the clerical elites in cooperation, and sometimes one wonders whether or not the security forces will at some point will get rid of the clerical forces if they could and take over. But this is the most recent development in the elite change that I have mentioned. So the best example is still Iran, but these last two patterns that I mentioned, pattern number 5 and pattern 6, one wonders, as the Arab awakening is taking place in much of the Arab world, whether or not their government will move in the direction that Iran has set, whether the alliance pattern that will emerge there would be more in tune with the kind of patterns that we have, especially this last pattern. There is certainly a lot of concern in the West regarding the Islamicists taking control, and if they do, then you may see cleric security forces alliance reappearing again. So that pretty much wraps up my third area of change. And of course, this brings me to the last area of change. And the last, or the fourth area of change, has to do with centralization of power. In other words, power was highly decentralized in a feudal society. As these societies began to go through the change process and began to change their identities and values, the revolution of rising expectation, identification with larger entities that we call nation, eventually, of course, led to power being more centralized and government control being more important. And as the government became more important, there was a much more significant institution building and institution differentiation. In other words, institutions that have clearly different set of functions that are required to run a modern society. So this change reflected in the greater concentration of power in the hands of the ruling elites is perhaps the most immediate and most obvious reflection of the process that I've been talking about. In the feudal system, it was a very different situation. The power lied in each fiefdom. In a modern society, the power gets concentrated. So much so that we have a term, a failed state, are states in which the government has lost control, doesn't have control. So if you want to be a state, you have to have power concentrated in the hands of ruling elites. And remember, a definition of government sometimes is called the monopoly of organized violence and force, monopoly of power. Now, in this process, they have developed pretty elaborate governmental institutions and bureaucracy to deal with this, and of course the military always gets beefed up because you need to maintain control over the masses, and military and security forces are very, very important. The other area is government control of the economy. That is also important for the simple reason that the ruling elite's survival depends on ensuring a relatively reasonable, a relatively decent standards of living. And if you accomplish that, even if you're not a democratic regime, you gain a measure of legitimacy. So to gain some legitimacy, economic performance, having standards of living that people basically are satisfied with is very crucial. And so that's why part of increased governmental control really includes or embraces making sure that the economy is working, and to do that it involves intervention. It involves making sure that you promote export, you promote import, and it involves a much greater degree of economic control in these countries than in the United States we are want to see in this country, because in contrast to Europe, our economic control is in the United States is less than in Europe and less than in most of the world. So this would be much more similar to what happens in Europe, or what has been happening in Europe, than in the United States. The other thing related to this is the military. When you think of the consequence of the centralization of power in the hands of the government in the Middle East, one of these is the emergence of military as the most powerful institution in the state. And this is not by accident, because it's not just allocation of resources that made the military much more powerful. It has a lot to do with the way the change process in the Middle East, and in much of the Third World actually, not just the Middle East, coincided with the onset of the Cold War. The onset of the Cold War meant that the United States is going to pour a lot of money into beefing up the military institutions of many of the countries that it figured to be its allies. And of course, for our purpose was not to make sure these military will be so strong that they would dominate. Our main consideration, at least in the short run anyway, was to make sure that they could kind of defend themselves if they need to. But the result was the military becomes the most modernized institution in the entire country, and very soon they want power. So the Cold War, in a sense, was critical in helping the military become much more powerful than other institutions, and therefore we sometimes don't think this through and just wonder why so many coups are occurring in these third world countries, as if we had absolutely nothing to do with the process of change. But a lot of it had to do with us beefing them up and making them so powerful, and so the civilian part of a government is helpless against them, and they can't fight them. The other part was, with the military being so powerful and the elites wanting to maintain their power, government is, or the modern state, as it were, is much better able to withstand pressures, uprising, challenges to their rules by the masses and by the opposition than any time before the history. So it is much more difficult to overthrow some governments nowadays. When I say that, I realize some of you may point to the Arab awakening and the fall of Mubarak, but for every Mubarak there is a Syria. So keep that in mind. And in the case of Mubarak, actually the military ended up moving against Mubarak. That made it easy. It's not, it really what happened in the Arab world doesn't contradicts what I said. Finally, I want to say that the institutionalization of this kind of a control, this kind of a concentration of power in the hands of the ruling elite makes it much more difficult to change governments and to move toward a more representative form of government if you don't already have one. It really does delay the transition to democratic representative forms of government. So to quickly summarize, there were 4 changes that we discussed, and I mentioned that they really represent a universal patterns of change. One was value change, and the impact of it, in the sense of most profound impact of it, was predisposition of masses to political participation. Masses, once the value changed from ascriptive to achievement, were much more likely to ask questions of their government, have expectations from their government, and demand changes. The second one was identity change, very profound change, and that translated in many cases into development of nationalism. And when that happens, you do not want to be dominated by foreign powers. The third and the fourth change, which were the topic of the last few segments, focused on elite change. We discussed at least 6 patterns or variations around those patterns that one can conceive of. And of course, the last one was concentration of power, increased governmental control, and the differentiation of the institutions. So the patterns of change that we saw in the Middle East really were in many ways universal. They had occurred in one form or another in Europe 2 centuries ago, and the change patterns in the Middle East by now is complete.